The Dorothy Chandler Pavilion hummed with pre-ceremony energy as Al Pacino adjusted his bow tie in the mirror of the green room backstage. March 29, 1993. After 8 nominations spanning 21 years, tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight, he was the frontrunner for Best Actor for his performance as Lieutenant Colonel Frank Slade in Scent of a Woman. The critics loved it, the audiences loved it, and for the first time in his career, Al felt like the Academy might finally recognize what he'd been giving to cinema for over 2 decades. At 53, Al had made peace with the possibility that he might never win an Oscar. He'd watched actors with half his experience and a quarter of his dedication walk away with the golden statue while he sat in the audience, applauding graciously and wondering what he had to do to earn the respect of his peers. Tonight felt different, but Al had learned not to count on anything when it came to Academy politics. The green room was elegant in the understated way that defined old Hollywood glamour. Cream-colored walls, comfortable leather chairs, and soft lighting that made everyone look younger and more refined. It was designed to be a sanctuary where nominees could collect themselves before facing the cameras and the scrutiny of a worldwide audience. Al sat alone, running through his potential acceptance speech one more time, trying to find the right balance between humility and gratitude. He wore a classic black tuxedo, perfectly tailored but without any flashy details that might distract from the evening's significance. Al had always believed that an actor's job was to disappear into their roles, and even at award ceremonies, he preferred to let his work speak rather than his appearance. The door opened quietly, and Al looked up to see a man in his early 60s entering the room. Distinguished silver hair, expensive tuxedo, the kind of confident posture that came from decades of wielding influence in Hollywood's most exclusive circles. Al recognized him immediately, Harold Whitman, a longtime Academy Board member who'd been involved in Oscar politics for nearly 30 years. Whitman was old Hollywood royalty, the son of a studio head who'd built his own empire in talent management and film distribution. He'd been instrumental in countless Oscar campaigns, and his opinion carried enormous weight in the closed-door conversations that often determined winners before the envelopes were ever opened. Al, Whitman said, his voice carrying the kind of practiced warmth that suggested this was a conversation he'd planned carefully. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I wanted to speak with you privately before the ceremony begins." Al stood, extending his hand. "Harold. Good to see you." Whitman's handshake was firm but brief, and he glanced around the room as if ensuring they wouldn't be overheard. The way he moved suggested this wasn't a casual pre-ceremony chat. "I'll get straight to the point," Whitman said, settling into the chair across from Al with the ease of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. "There's been considerable discussion among Academy members about tonight's Best Actor category." Al felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. He'd heard this tone before, the careful, diplomatic voice that preceded disappointment. "What kind of discussion?" Whitman crossed his legs, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp and calculating. "Your performance in Scent of a Woman has generated a great deal of enthusiasm, certainly. The standing ovation at the premiere, the critical reviews, the box office success. Very impressive work." The way Whitman emphasized "very impressive" suggested that praise was about to be followed by a significant but. However, Whitman continued, "There are concerns within certain circles of the Academy about whether this particular performance represents the kind of work we want to honor with our highest award." Al kept his expression neutral, but his hands tightened slightly on the arms of his chair. "What kind of concerns?" Whitman leaned forward, his voice dropping to the conspiratorial tone that Hollywood insiders used when discussing sensitive topics. "Al, you're a tremendously talented actor. No one questions that. Your work in The Godfather trilogy, Serpico, Dog Day Afternoon, these are important contributions to American cinema. But?" Al prompted, knowing there was more coming. "But there's a feeling among some Academy members that you've been pigeonholed, shall we say, into a particular type of performance. The intense, shouting, method-acting approach that's become your signature." Whitman paused, perhaps waiting for Al to respond, but Al remained silent, sensing that the real purpose of this conversation hadn't been revealed yet. "Scent of a Woman represents more of the same, doesn't it?" Whitman continued. Frank Slade is essentially Al Pacino being Al Pacino, just with blindness as a character trait. The same intensity, the same vocal techniques, the same psychological approach you've been using for 20 years. Al felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice level. Frank Slade is a complex character dealing with disability, depression, and moral compromise. The performance required months of preparation with blind veterans to understand. Whitman waved dismissively. Yes, the preparation. We've all heard about your method acting dedication. Very admirable, very thorough. But Al, the Academy has always honored versatility, range, the ability to disappear completely into different characters. The criticism stung because it echoed doubts Al had wrestled with throughout his career. Was he trapped by his own intensity? Had his commitment to psychological realism become a limitation rather than a strength? What exactly are you saying, Harold? Whitman's expression became more serious, his diplomatic mask slipping slightly to reveal something harder underneath. I'm saying that there are influential Academy members who feel that giving you the Oscar for Scent of a Woman would be rewarding more of the same rather than celebrating genuine artistic growth. Al stood slowly, his movement controlled but carrying an undercurrent of tension that made Whitman lean back slightly in his chair. Are you telling me that the Academy has already decided I shouldn't win tonight? Whitman raised his hands in a placating gesture. Nothing has been decided, Al. But there are conversations happening, preferences being expressed. The Academy takes its responsibility very seriously. We want to honor performances that represent the best of what acting can be. And you don't think my performance in Scent of a Woman represents that? Whitman was quiet for a moment, perhaps calculating how much truth he could reveal without creating an enemy. I think your performance in Scent of a Woman represents excellent craftsmanship within a very narrow range. But the Academy has always valued actors who can completely transform themselves, who can become unrecognizable from role to role. Al walked to the window overlooking the theater's entrance, where hundreds of fans were gathered behind barriers, hoping for glimpses of their favorite stars. The irony wasn't lost on him, those fans loved his intensity, his commitment, his refusal to compromise his artistic vision. But the people who supposedly represented the pinnacle of film artistry saw those same qualities as limitations. 21 years, Harold, Al said, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that made Whitman shift uncomfortably. 8 nominations. How many actors have given more to this industry? How many have been more committed to the craft? Commitment isn't in question, Whitman replied. It's about evolution, about showing range beyond what you've already established. Al turned back to face Whitman, and something in his expression made the older man straighten in his chair. Let me ask you something, Al said, his voice taking on the intensity that had defined his most memorable performances. When you watch Daniel Day-Lewis, do you criticize him for being too committed to his characters? When you see Marlon Brando's work, do you dismiss it as more of the same, because he brought psychological truth to every role? Whitman opened his mouth to respond, but Al continued before he could speak. Or is it possible that what you're really saying is that Al Pacino's particular brand of intensity makes some Academy members uncomfortable? That my refusal to play the Hollywood game, to give you the kind of safe, predictable performances that fit neatly into award season campaigns, has finally caught up with me? The room fell silent except for the distant sound of crowds gathering outside. Whitman looked genuinely surprised by the directness of Al's response, perhaps not expecting such a forceful pushback. That's not what I'm saying at all, Whitman protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Then what are you saying? Al asked, moving closer to Whitman's chair. Because it sounds like you came here to prepare me for disappointment, to let me know that despite 8 nominations and 21 years of work, the Academy still doesn't think I deserve recognition. But before Whitman could answer, the door opened and a production assistant appeared. Clipboard in hand and headset around her neck. Mr. Pacino, we need you for your presenter introduction in 15 minutes, she said, then noticed Whitman and added apologetically, I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were in a meeting." "It's fine," Al said, his eyes never leaving Whitman's face. "We're just finishing up." The assistant nodded and left, but her interruption had shifted something in the room's energy. Whitman seemed to sense that his window for this conversation was closing, and whatever he'd hoped to accomplish needed to happen quickly. "Al," Whitman said, rising from his chair with the careful movements of someone trying to regain control of a situation that had gotten away from him. "I didn't come here to upset you. I came here as a courtesy, to give you perspective on the conversations that are happening." Al looked at Whitman for a long moment, his dark eyes carrying an intensity that made the older man visibly uncomfortable. When Al finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the kind of controlled power that had made him one of the most respected actors of his generation. "Harold, let me give you some perspective." Al moved to the center of the room, his presence suddenly commanding the space in a way that made Whitman seem smaller by comparison. "When I started acting, I was told I was too intense, too ethnic, too strange-looking to be a leading man. When I got my first film role, I was told I was too theatrical, too stage-oriented to succeed in movies. When I started getting nominated for Oscars, I was told I was too limited, too one-note to deserve recognition." Al's voice gained strength with each sentence, not louder but deeper, more resonant. "For 21 years, I've been hearing variations of the same message: Al Pacino is good, but not quite good enough. Al Pacino is talented, but not quite Academy Award material. Al Pacino is committed, but not quite the right kind of committed." Whitman opened his mouth to interrupt, but something in Al's expression stopped him. "You want to know about range?" Al asked, his voice taking on the cadence of someone delivering a prepared argument that had been building for decades. "Let me tell you about range." Al began pacing, his movement controlled but purposeful, like a lawyer addressing a jury. "Michael Corleone wasn't just a character I played. I spent 2 years learning to think like a Sicilian, learning to understand how family and violence and power intersect in ways that most Americans can't comprehend. I didn't just put on a costume and recite lines. I became someone whose psychology was completely foreign to my own experience." Al stopped pacing and looked directly at Whitman. "Frank Serpico required me to ride with undercover narcotics officers, to understand what it means to risk your life every day for principles that nobody else seems to care about. I learned what corruption looks like from the inside, what it costs to be honest in a dishonest system." Whitman remained silent, perhaps recognizing that he was witnessing something more than a defensive response to criticism. "Tony Montana," Al continued, his voice gaining intensity, "demanded that I understand the mind of someone desperate enough to kill for success, paranoid enough to destroy everything he'd built rather than trust anyone else. I spent months in Miami learning how desperation and intelligence and violence create men who believe the world owes them everything." Al moved closer to Whitman, close enough that the older man could see the passion burning in his eyes. "And Frank Slade required me to spend 4 months learning to live without sight, to understand how blindness changes not just what you see but how you think, how you relate to other people, how you navigate a world designed for people who aren't like you." Al's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow it seemed to fill the entire room. "That's not one note, Harold. That's not the same performance over and over. That's an actor willing to risk his sanity, his health, his personal relationships to find the truth of characters that most people wouldn't have the courage to explore." The silence that followed was profound. Whitman stood motionless, perhaps realizing that what he'd intended as a diplomatic warning had become something much more significant. "You say the Academy values versatility," Al said, his voice returning to normal volume but retaining its intensity. "I say the Academy is afraid of actors who dig too deep, who find uncomfortable truths about human nature and refuse to pretty them up for mass consumption." Al walked back to the window, looking out at the crowds gathering for the ceremony. "You know what I think this is really about, Harold? I think this is about an industry that's more comfortable with safe choices than honest ones. You'd rather give awards to actors who disappear into characters without challenging anyone's assumptions about what those characters should be. Al turned back to face Whitman, and his expression had shifted to something approaching pity. "You came here to prepare me for disappointment, to let me know that 8 nominations might not be enough, that 21 years of work might not matter if the Academy decides my particular brand of truth-telling is too intense for their comfort." Whitman found his voice, but it lacked the authority it had carried when he'd entered the room. "Al, that's not. I never said you didn't deserve recognition." "No," Al agreed, "you just said I didn't deserve it tonight, for this performance, because it's too similar to all my other work that apparently also didn't deserve recognition." Al sat back down, his movement deliberate and controlled, like someone who had made a decision. "Here's what I'm going to do, Harold. I'm going to go out there tonight, and if they call my name, I'm going to accept that Oscar. Not because the Academy finally decided I was good enough, but because I know I've earned it through 21 years of refusing to compromise my artistic vision for anyone's comfort." Al's voice took on a new quality, something that might have been resolve mixed with something that might have been defiance. "And if they don't call my name, if the Academy decides that 8 nominations is enough recognition for a career of work they apparently find troubling, then I'm going to know exactly where I stand with an organization that claims to represent the best in film artistry." Whitman shifted uncomfortably, perhaps realizing that he'd accomplished the opposite of what he'd intended. Instead of preparing Al for gracious disappointment, he'd crystallized Al's understanding of exactly what was at stake. "But either way," Al continued, "I'm done apologizing for bringing psychological truth to characters that demand it. I'm done pretending that intensity is a limitation rather than a strength. And I'm done accepting the premise that Al Pacino needs to change to deserve the Academy's respect." Al stood again, this time with the clear intention of ending the conversation. "The Academy has a choice to make tonight, Harold. They can honor an actor who's spent his career pushing the boundaries of what film performance can be, or they can send a message that such dedication isn't what they're looking for." Al moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at Whitman. "But understand this, whatever they decide tonight won't change what I've contributed to this industry. It'll only reveal what kind of organization the Academy really is." 3 hours later, when Glenn Close opened the envelope and announced Al Pacino for Scent of a Woman, the applause that followed was thunderous and sustained. Al's acceptance speech was brief, gracious, and gave no indication of the conversation that had taken place in the green room. But Harold Whitman, watching from his seat in the auditorium, understood that he'd witnessed something more significant than a pre-ceremony warning. He'd seen an artist define his relationship with an institution that had struggled for decades to understand what he represented. Within days, word of the backstage conversation had spread through Hollywood's insider networks. The story evolved and grew, but the core remained consistent. Al Pacino had been warned that the Academy didn't think he deserved recognition, and his response had been both a defense of his artistic approach and a challenge to the Academy's values. Years later, when film students studied the politics of Oscar campaigns, Al's 1993 victory was cited as a turning point, the moment when the Academy was forced to confront its own biases about what constituted worthy performance. Al never spoke publicly about his conversation with Harold Whitman. But his subsequent career choices suggested that the exchange had clarified something important about his relationship with industry recognition. He continued choosing challenging, intense roles that demanded psychological depth, regardless of their Oscar potential. The Academy, for its part, seemed to have learned something as well. In the years following Al's victory, they began recognizing more unconventional performances, more psychologically complex work, more actors who refused to compromise their artistic vision for mass appeal. Harold Whitman retired from the Academy board 2 years later. In his farewell speech, he mentioned the importance of recognizing artistic courage, even when it made audiences uncomfortable. He never mentioned Al Pacino by name, but everyone in the room understood what he was really talking about. The conversation in the green room lasted less than 15 minutes, but its impact on Academy politics and Al's career lasted decades. Sometimes the most important exchanges happen not on stage, but in the quiet moments before the cameras roll, when artists and institutions define their relationship to each other. Al Pacino's 1993 Oscar wasn't just recognition for a single performance. It was vindication of an artistic approach that prioritized truth over comfort, depth over safety, and psychological honesty over crowd-pleasing accessibility. And it all began with a conversation that was supposed to prepare him for disappointment.